know, I'm old enough to remember a day when PowerPoint meant hymnals, and they didn't break, and you didn't have to plug them in, and you didn't have to recharge them, but it wasn't nearly this much fun, and that's really cool. I was asked to put this up real quickly by our staff. I write this daily article that Ross mentioned before, and if that's something you'd like to sign up for, you can do it right there. So that's the advertisement, right? So we live in a confusing, perplexing world. I brought some examples of that. That's unambiguous, isn't it? Whichever way you go, you're either right or wrong, I guess. Did no one proof this? Did no one check this before they decided to do that? At least they said please. Before you get on an elevator that doesn't work, at least they said please. I was in an airplane not long ago, and we were getting ready to take off, and we're barreling down the runway, and all at once the pilot pulls the plane off to the side, and he comes on the intercom, and he says, "There's a warning light up here that shouldn't be on, but we think we can fix it." And I'm thinking, I don't want the pilot to fix this, but then the minute they said they fixed it and we took off, and it was a religious experience, and so maybe an elevator kind of works that way as well. Here's a fourth kind of example of confusion. So the way this works is if you're going to touch the wire, make sure you have $200 in your pocket, because after we kill you, we're going to find you, is how this works, I guess. It's a confusing world, not least because of the topic we're here to discuss tonight. So my next slide shows you cutting-edge mobile technology when I was in high school. Right? Remember? Those of you that don't understand this just don't understand this. I'm sorry. This is my father's World War II manual typewriter. It got me through high school and college and my master's in divinity. This machine did. It's been sitting in a closet forever. Some years ago, my sons got it out of the closet. They pulled it out of the case and they said, "What is it?" I said, "Well, what do you think it is?" And they said, "Well, it looks like maybe a printer or something. Maybe you could put paper in it." They had never seen. They're 31 and 29. They had never seen one of those. Now I'm really old, right? I knew I was getting older every day, but now I'm really old. When I was in high school, this was cutting-edge technology for calculating right there. That thing cost more than $100, and it didn't do what your pocket cell phone does today, right? How quickly it's all changing. A few more examples of that. If I were to ask you the world's largest taxi company, would you say Uber, which owns no cars, no taxis? If I ask you the world's largest media platform, the answer would be Facebook, which owns no content. If I ask you the world's most valuable retailer, your answer should be Alibaba, which has no inventory. And if I ask you the world's most profitable hospitality company, your answer should be Airbnb, which owns no properties. So how does that work, right? Technology has been defined as anything that was invented after you were born. Right? Feels that way, doesn't it? There's a better definition, actually. John Dyer, who teaches at DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary, has a terrific book on a theology of technology that I recommend to you. And he defines technology as the human activity of using tools to transform God's creation for practical purposes. I think that's as good as we'll do. Tonight, very quickly, I'd like to walk with you through these 5 applications of that definition. Technology in the future, why we fear technology, how technology is changing us, how it's changing our culture, and then where ultimately we want to go, of course, using technology biblically. And then I'm really excited about the panel discussion that will come together to discuss in just a bit. So earlier this year, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, published their predictions of 10 technological innovations we will see this year. As we're thinking of technology and the future as in this year future, here's their list. First, 3D metal printing. This year, enabling contractors to be able to produce buildings and all sorts of material out of 3D printing capacities. What's that going to do to job losses? What will that do to our economy as that becomes the new norm? Artificial embryos. I work with Baylor Scott and White Health as their resident scholar for ethics, and we could have a long conversation about genetic medicine and artificial embryos. At the very least, I can tell you that we're moving ever and ever closer scientifically to the age when we can clone human organs and someday perhaps even human beings. And what will that mean for us morally and ethically? We're not there yet. We're not there yet. It's illegal to do that, to clone humans per se, but there are researchers specifically in China that are working hard on that even as we speak. Smart cities. Maybe you saw the news report that was out this week where there's some houses now being built in California that are built entirely on the Alexa platform. So that through Alexa, you can control not only your television and your climate control, you can control your sprinkler system, you can control the locking of your doors and your going and coming through your garage. Everything about your house is going to be controlled through this one system. And what happens when someone hacks that? What happens to your personal information in a world like that? Is this going to be kind of this surveillance kind of world that has been prophesied all these years, kind of a George Orwellian sort of a world? Is that where we're headed? Cloud-based AI services and neural artificial intelligence networks, moving quickly to a day when, according to some, artificial intelligence will be smarter than we are, and will it agree to cohere with us on the planet or not? Are we going to be in that 2001 Space Odyssey world as we're moving closer to a day? Some call it the singularity, when AI will be more capable than we are and capable of thinking in a sense of working intuitively to solve problems. And when that happens, then what does the world look like? Earbuds that translate instantly are going to be a thing this year. And will terrorists be able to use those in ways that we would wish them not to? Zero carbon natural gas, and what will that mean for our economy and for our energy producing sectors? Perfected online privacy, as though there is any such thing as perfected online privacy. Genetic fortune telling moving to eugenics, the ability through in vitro fertilization to, it's called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where you create embryos in the laboratory and then you test them for 2,000 diseases. We're doing that today. But the day is coming when we might be able to test them and even engineer them for capacities, athletic abilities, or singing voices, or intelligence. That day could come. And is that how everybody will have children? Will this be eugenics? What will that mean to the future of the species? And then last, quantum computing. And what will that mean to your personal information and the ability to keep that private? And those are just the things that are supposed to happen this year. And you see the positives, and you see the negatives, and you see the ambiguities in all of this, and how confusing and perplexing and complex all of that is. So, why is it that we fear this stuff so much? It's been suggested that Abraham Lincoln was closer to Father Abraham in terms of technology than he is to our culture today. That Abraham Lincoln's world would have been more at home in the day of the patriarch Abraham than he would be in our culture today. We have to thank for that this man, George Moore, and what's known as Moore's Law. Back in 1965, he made the observation that's so far still holding true, which is that smart chips, computer chips, are going to double in their capacities every 2 years. That's happening. To illustrate that, imagine a chessboard. Imagine that you place 2 grains of rice in the first corner on the bottom left, and they start doubling every square, 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 and so forth. By the time you get to the second half of the square, your number is 18 quintillion. That's what doubling does. And that's what's happening in our technology. That was a cell phone 30 years ago. Cutting edge stuff, right? You remember? Anybody have one of those cell phones built into your car? Remember those things? How awesome they were? I remember the first cell phone I had that you could carry around that didn't need its own battery. And that's 30 years ago. The first iPhone came out in 2007. Think about iPhone today versus iPhone then, and you're seeing the speed and the rate at which technology is moving. And the problem is that we can't move as fast as it does until this present generation Technological advances moved at such a pace that culture could keep up. It took generations to move from the agrarian age to the industrial age, to move from the farm to the factory. And it took generations to move from the industrial age and rural into cities, to move further into kind of what we think of the information age as now. I mean, there were days when you could sit next to your father or your grandfather or your grandson in church, and you would all worship out of the same style, and you would all be using the same translation, and you'd all be familiar with the same technology, and church was church was church. Well, of course, that's not the case now. My grandfather, who served in World War I, changed his employer 3 times in his life, which made him exactly average. The person entering the workforce today changes their vocation 7 times. Not just their employer, their vocation 7 times. And so the bottom line is technology, especially digital technology, is changing our culture more rapidly than we can keep up. And when you're in a context like that, fear is a normal human emotion. Mary Shelley, who should know something about that wrote the book Frankenstein, said, "Nothing is so painful to the human mind as a great and sudden change." Isn't that true? It's been said the only one that likes change is a wet baby. And there's some truth in that. I didn't have a slide for that. You're grateful for that. It's also been said change is good until it happens. And isn't that true as well? So let's talk about some of the ways that technology is changing us. And then we'll talk about ways technology is changing our culture, and then we'll see what the Bible would say about all of this. In John Dyer's book, he suggests that you think of technology as a shovel. You're using a shovel to dig a hole or to plant a tree or whatever you're doing, but all the while you're using the shovel is using you. You're changing things with the shovel, but the shovel's changing you. Your hands are getting calloused, or they're getting blistered, your back is getting sore. Things are happening to you all the while you're using this tool. You're being changed by the tool. That is categorically the case with digital technology on an unprecedented level in human history. Some examples. Information overload. Scientists, brain scientists, know the part of your prefrontal cortex that processes information. And through MRI scans and other experimentation, they have been able to determine that when that part of your brain receives an information overload, it shuts down. It simply can't process, and it stops. It quits. You've heard of the paralysis of analysis. You've probably been in a situation at some point where it seemed like it was just too much. You just couldn't keep up. You couldn't think about it anymore. Well, that's a physiological fact. That's a thing. There is a thing, such as information overload, that actually happens to us physiologically in our brains. There's a decline of writing skills that's been documented in this culture. Young people are writing more than ever before because of texts and Twitter, but they're writing differently than ever before. Grammar doesn't work in the Twitterverse, right? Following methods that we grew up thinking were important to good communication is no longer relevant in that world. And so writing technologies are changing writing techniques, and there's actual physiological rewiring that's happening inside the brain. It's not just that some folk can't communicate the way that older generations did in the sense of not wanting to, it's happening in a sense of not being able to, of literally processing differently. Another example of that is shorter attention spans. You saw that in the slideshow that started the night, the video that started us all here. The attention span of the typical goldfish and then the typical American. We're just being conditioned by that. You're thinking about all the visual things that are happening in your life. You're thinking about the ads that are bombarding you and the shorter attention spans that go with that. We're at a day now where people don't read a Wikipedia article, they read the first paragraph, or they read the first sentence of a Wikipedia article. When Twitter went from 140 to 280 characters, there was a lot of pushback from folk that didn't want to read 280 characters, didn't have the attention span for 280 characters. The only place in America where we're asking young people to sit still for 30 minutes while someone talks to them is in church. That's not happening in their schools. That's not happening in their social lives. That's not happening anyplace else. Watch the evening news and track how much time you actually see the face of the newsreader. versus how much time you're seeing clips and going to other reporters and seeing images behind them. Just track that next time. They're doing that on purpose. They're doing that because they have to do that. They're doing that because attention spans are changing, are being rewired, as it were, by digital technology. Changing relational skills. This is a point that Ross made as he and I were talking about this conversation, especially. I hadn't thought of it quite this way. We know so many people now on social media, but we don't know our neighbors. And the way in which we know people is the way that we wish to be known. And so we can use our own anonymity, or we can make up screen names. We can project the person we wish we are, what's called the idealized self, and they're doing the same thing. We're meeting people on dating apps. We're meeting people through this kind of digital curtain that's really keeping us separate from each other, where we don't see the real person. And we get comfortable with that. All the while we don't even know our neighbor, really, or at all. There's a cocooning that's happening in the culture. You get in your car, you drive out of your driveway, you push the button to close the garage door, you drive to work, you do your work, you come back, you pull back into the driveway, you go back in your house, and you go home, and you're done. I live in Dallas. We have a neighbor, our next-door neighbor, that just moved in from Atlanta, where I used to live and pastor at one point. He lived in an older part of Atlanta, in the area down around Emory University, beautiful place. But one of the things he noticed when he lived in Atlanta, in that part of the city, was everybody had porches. In Dallas, where he lives, where we live, nobody has porches. I mean, we have enough of a porch to get to the front door, but you remember the day when people had like porches with rocking chairs, and they would sit out at night and they would greet their neighbors and they would talk to each other? Now we don't build houses for that because nobody wants to do that, because relational skills are so different from what they once were. Multitasking doesn't work, but we try. It's been documented that multitasking is the least efficient way to accomplish tasks. But nonetheless, we've got our screens, multiple screens, and our Twitter feeds going over here, and we're watching what's happening on Facebook over here, and we're watching what's going on some news feed over here while we're working over here, and we're listening to music all the while, and we're texting on our phones, and we wonder why we're frustrated and why education is suffering, and we're wondering why we're not getting done what we used to get done, and digital technology is just immersing us in multitasking, and it doesn't work. And then there's a thing known as digital addiction. It's a very real thing. There are tests. In fact, all that I'm talking to you about right now is also a white paper that's going to be available to you at the end of the night, and it'll be in the back there. And there's some links there as well. There's a link to an online digital addiction test that you can take. And there are a number of these that you can Google to find. And they have some pretty scary questions. How comfortable are you if you can't find your cell phone? If you're leaving your house for 30 minutes and leave your cell phone at home, do you turn around and go back to get it? Do you take it with you to bed? Sorry to ask, do you take it with you to the bathroom? Majority of people do. How do you feel inside when you're not on social media? Things like that. There's an endorphin thing that happens. There are physiological reactions to social media, to likes and follows and shares and validation and all that comes from other people being in this community of social media responses. And it's a chemically addictive process for many. There are treatment centers, there are actually 12-step treatment programs for digital addiction these days. That's how it's changing us. How's it changing our culture? Very briefly, digital technology. Loss of personal information. Mark Zuckerberg and his recent testimony before Congress, and the fact that we think we have personal information that we have secure, and it turns out we really don't. So the other day, I was in Israel last week. I get to go to Israel every spring to lead study tours, and we were flying back, and I was in Newark on the way back to Dallas, and the guy next to me on the plane turns out to be a guy who lives in Dallas that works for Amazon. And has done so, he says, since 2005, I believe he said. And so I found this interesting, and I got in conversation with him. I asked him, well, is there any technology out there that people use that you just don't use? He said, I don't use Alexa. I said, well, why don't you use Alexa? He said, because, now this is just his theory, all right? I haven't researched this. I don't know if this is true. But his belief is that in order for Alexa to be all the time available to your voice so that you can speak to it at any point, its microphone is on such that it can hear anything happening in your house. And what it's hearing could be available to the cloud. and could be available to advertisers. So that you're watching television, and Alexa's listening to what you're watching on television, so that ads that align with your television interests magically appear the next time you go online. And he doesn't use Alexa, just because he has a fear of that possibility. I don't know. I don't work for Amazon. The loss of personal information is, we're more aware now than we've ever been, is really a frightening way in which culture is having to adapt to the digital age. Obviously, fake news. We could have a long conversation, right, about fake news and what is and isn't. And once you decide truth is what you believe it to be, which is what America has decided, then I guess all news can be fake in some sense. Less solitude than ever before, because again, our technology follows us everywhere we go. I'm going to propose the idea of a fast from technology in just a little bit. Just like you think of fasting from food, Ramadan is this week for Muslims, you think of fasting from various things, I'm going to propose a fast from technology. A narrowed worldview. You can now, and you know this, you can architect your news feeds so that you only get the news from the sources that you want and that you happen to agree with. And so you can only listen to Fox News and only get things that come from Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or whatever party you affiliate with or whatever politicians you support or whatever worldview you believe. And we're seeing this huge widening of the gap in America politically. We're seeing this huge chasm between Democrats and Republicans, especially those that are kind of on the extreme sides of this. Saw a survey the other day that said the majority of each party would not want their children to marry someone from the other party. Majority of Republicans wouldn't want a child to marry a Democrat. Majority of Democrats wouldn't want their child to marry a Republican. And some of that is for other reasons, but some of it is this narrowed worldview where we're able to architect the news that we consume and the worldview that it represents. More information, but less wisdom. We're able to access information, but we don't really acquire it anymore. We don't have to learn it because it's on our cell phone. I was at a World Economic Forum meeting in Dallas a couple years ago where Henry Kissinger was speaking, and I heard him say something I hadn't thought about. He said, we have more access to knowledge than ever before, but less wisdom. Because in his mind, wisdom is built on acquisition of knowledge. We have to know something before we can derive wisdom from it. And we don't know it because we have it available to us through technology, and so we know less, and therefore have less basis for the wisdom that comes from knowledge. I find there to be logic in his supposition. Obviously, the availability of pornography through digital platforms, more than ever, and more of it free than ever. And pornographic addictions, and all the horror that comes with that plague. Threats to your family, threats to your kids. We'll talk about some of this in the panel. We'll talk about this as well. What we can do to keep our kids from various addictions that are available through digital platforms, through sexting, through videos that they post that follow them forever. There are whole marriage therapy practices right now centering on ways to help spouses deal with digital technology and the fact that they're together but they're not. You know, you walk into a restaurant and you see people sitting at the same table sharing, in essence, the same experience, but they're on their own screens, and they may as well be in separate worlds. And you're seeing this more and more happening inside couples and families, and we'll talk about some of that in just a bit. And then what I would consider to be self-idolatry. The basic sin in all of human nature goes back to Genesis 3, where Satan tempts the woman to say, if she eats the forbidden fruit, you will be like God. That's the only sin there is. Everything we do by way of sin is a variation on that theme. Nietzsche said the will to power is the basic drive in human nature, and he was exactly right. All sin is our desire to be our own God, and technology promises to help. Offers us the illusion of control, offers us the illusion of omniscience and omnipotence, and leads so easily to self-idolatry. So last, how do we respond to this biblically? I want to make these suggestions. First of all, use technology within a biblical worldview. We could have a long conversation that we don't have time for tonight, but let me try to do this really quickly. I'm going to subject you to about 2 minutes of philosophy, all right? Ross didn't know I was going to do this, wouldn't have invited me had he known. I'm going to try to make this as painless as possible. So we go back in time, all right? Go back to the era, let's say that we're 600 years before Christ or so, all right? There's this wandering philosopher guy, poet guy named Orpheus, who comes up with this crazy idea that your soul existed in some pre-incarnate state and it sinned, we would say, and it was punished by being put inside your body, and the point of life is to purify your soul so that when you die it can go back where it came from. Now that's just one idea among other ideas. But it influenced Pythagoras, who influenced Plato, who influenced the whole Western world. So in the Western world, we make this distinction between the soul and the body, and the spiritual and the secular, and religion and the real world. The way the Greeks did religion might sound familiar. You go to the altar of whatever god you need to worship because you have this transactional relationship. You're going to sea, so you're going to worship Neptune. You're going to war, so you're going to worship Ares. You make a sacrifice to the god, so the god will give you what you want. You don't have a personal communion with these gods. You have a transactional relationship, not a transformational relationship. It's a transactional religion. It's like going to church on Sunday, so God will bless you on Monday. It's like having a quiet time at the start of the day, so God will bless your day. It's like giving money to God so that God will bless your money. Does that sound familiar? It's a transactional religion. That's our culture. We've inherited from the Greeks and the Romans this whole worldview that separates the God parts of your life from the other parts of your life. Walk the dog, took out the trash, read the Bible, check the box, check the God box. And so because we've learned to separate God into a part of our lives, we have these whole realms of our lives, these whole technological areas of our lives that we really separate from the Lordship of Jesus Christ. And we have this idea, so long as we go to church and try to be good and read and pray, that kind of what we do with all this stuff is just kind of our stuff, you know? C.S. Lewis says we're like honest people that pay their taxes, but certainly hope there's money left over to do what they want. You do your religious stuff and you're kind of free to do what you want to do. Well, the right way to see technology is the right way to see any dimension of your life, to see all of it as under the sovereignty of Jesus Christ. To say this is your Father's world, as Ross said at the beginning, to understand that God's still on his throne and he's still in charge, and to put him in charge of every part of your life, technology especially. So you remember the great commandments. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Technology can be your friend. There are enormous ways technology can help you love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. For instance, I should have brought it out, I guess. I've got it in my briefcase back there. I've got an iPad that I use for my own personal Bible study. It's got a Bible app on it. This particular app that I use gives me the ability to make notes inside the text. It gives me some study Bible notes over here. It gives me access to the internet for anything I want to look up. It's by far the easiest way I have yet discovered to be able to study Scripture immersively. And it's all on this iPad. The same iPad that gives me access to daily readings from Oswald Chambers and C.S. Lewis and Charles Spurgeon and other people that I like to read. And all of that sits right here. And it goes with me. I can do it on my cell phone. I can do it here. There are technological platforms that will enable us to study Scripture and to be engaged in spiritual disciplines in ways that are really liberating. You can architect a playlist that will help you to worship. You can have access to some of the most significant Bible teachers in the world through their podcasts and through their websites available to you. Technology can be an incredible bridge to help us to love God more deeply if we'll use the opportunities that are available to us. Digital technology can be a tremendous tool in loving our neighbor as ourselves. Obviously, with texting and with email, you can keep up with people, you can encourage people, you can pray for people, you can stay in touch with people all around the world. I go to Cuba a lot. I've been down 10 times over the years, and I can be in touch in ways with my Cuban brothers and sisters through technological platforms that I could never have been in a pre-digital technology world. I have to be careful how I do that. Our technology all goes through the government servers, and so I don't say I'm going down to preach. I say I'm going down to share. I'm not talking to ministers, I'm talking to friends. You have to use code language a little bit. But nonetheless, we can maintain this kind of love your neighbor as yourself priority through technological means that just didn't exist 10, 20 years ago, as long as we're looking for the opportunity. Second, I would suggest using technology to serve your family and have some practical suggestions very quickly. First of all, severely limit screen time for children. We have panelists that know much more about this than I do that will get up here in just a moment, but from what I've been reading, the younger your children, the more significant this issue is. I mean, I've read people that would say if they're under the age of 7, they just don't allow them access some to digital technology, to the two-dimensional screen world and that sort of thing. That's up to you, of course, and we'll have others that can help us with that. But at the very least, severely limit screen time for children. Have to model behavior for your family. You can ask your kids not to be living 24/7 on their cell phones if you are. Deuteronomy 6 says that we're to teach God's word to our children, right? Whether they get up or whether we lie down, they're to be on our doorposts and our thresholds. We're to be modeling for others what godly behavior looks like. Then a book to recommend to you by Andy Crouch, who's a terrific writer in cultural issues, used to be the editor of Christianity Today. I just found this book recently, The Tech-Wise Family. Highly recommend it to you. Downloaded it to my iPad, of course, and was impressed. He's got kind of 10 commandments here for tech-wise families. Here are just a few of them. Turn off technology 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, and 1 week a year, Andy suggests. And if you can't do that, we need to go back and have that conversation about digital addiction. If you can't do that, use screens for a purpose, not just to kill time. If you're on a screen, there's a reason you're on the screen, or you're not on the screen. He says car time is conversation time. That's a rule in his family. When you get in the car, the screens go off. And again, if you can't do that, we need to talk about digital addiction, right? Spouses have each other's passwords, and parents have complete access to children's devices. Absolutely critical. And if there's any reason you don't want to do that, then there's a larger issue here, right? Last, using technology to serve the kingdom. Technology has always been with us, just not on a digital context. This was technology when 10 Commandments were carved into stone tablets. That was a tool that was used to advance humanity. And then we got to papyrus, and then we got to parchment, and that was technology. That was cutting-edge technology. This was hugely significant, the Gutenberg Press, making possible not only the printing and the distribution of Scripture, but in many ways the Reformation as a result of all of that. Now the question we ought to be asking ourselves is, how can we be using technology to advance the kingdom today? What could you be using your cell phones and your smart devices to do, not only to know God and love God more fully, but to love your neighbor more effectively? What could you be doing? One quick example before I'm done. This organization, Global Media Outreach, founded by my dear friend Walt Wilson. Walt worked for Steve Jobs back when Jobs was first president of Apple, before he left and all of that, and came back after. When Jobs left, Walt left and did several different technology firms, software stuff. Apple stores were Walt Wilson's idea. Back when Steve Jobs didn't want to do retail, and Walt Wilson convinced him he ought to do retail, and Walt turned out to be right, you would say. And so when Steve Jobs left the first time, Walt left Apple and did these software things and became very, very successful in all of this. And some 20 years ago, Walt began asking himself, all right, with this platform, what could we do to get the gospel to every person on earth? So he founded an organization called Global Media Outreach. That is just one example. These are just people I happen to know and work with. They're headquartered in Dallas now. We're in Silicon Valley for years. They have, in recent years, through mobile platforms, through partnerships with Google and Toyota and Coca-Cola and other platforms and such as that, they can document that they have so far been able to share the gospel with more than 1 billion people. And that's just one organization. Their goal, if Walt were standing up here, and he should be, you'd love Walt Wilson. He's in his 80s, he's a former Marine, no such thing as a former Marine, you know what I mean? Just an amazing human being. Walt's incredible. If Walt were standing up here, and you'd ask him to come and talk to you about GMO, you'd have to give him time frame because he can talk to you all night. They have a goal, they have a vision over the next 3 to 5 years to give every person on the planet 7 exposures to the gospel. And they're moving that direction. It's been said, and we're familiar with this idea, that God has a place for us in His providence. That God called me to be in Dallas today. God called you to be in Marble Falls. God called your pastor to be here and to be in this church. And obviously we believe in God's providence, and we believe in the sense that God has place for us. But God also has time for us. God has not only a where, but a when in His providence. It's by God's providence that you and I are alive right now, and not 100 years ago, or 100 years from now if the Lord tarries. And so as confusing as tonight's conversation might seem, as challenging as some of these breakthroughs and innovations are, If you and I couldn't use the platforms available to us to the glory of God, we wouldn't be here. We're here right now for such a time as this. And remember this, please, and with this I'll be done. Every person you see, every person you meet, every person you know, every person that you're going to meet next is somebody who's going to live forever someplace. They're going to live eternally someplace. C.S. Lewis says, "You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit." 10,000 millennia after iPhones are forgotten, every person you know will be eternally somewhere, with God or separated from God. So the prayer of the night, I think, is, Lord, how do we use the opportunities of this incredible revolution in a way that helps somebody follow Jesus? If you'll ask him that question, he'll answer it in your life, your heart, and your influence. Well, thank you so much for the privilege of sharing some of this with you. As I said, this is in a white paper you can pick up on the way out if you wish. Just kind of an introduction to the issue, but I'm honored to be able to share it with you. So.